Absurdism is the philosophical theory that existence in general is absurd. This implies that the world lacks meaning or a higher purpose and is not fully intelligible by reason. The term absurd also has a more specific sense in the context of absurdism. It refers to a conflict or a discrepancy between two things, but there are several disagreements about their exact nature. These agreements have various consequences for whether absurdism is true and for the arguments cited in favor or against it. Popular accounts characterize the conflict as a collision between rational man and an irrational universe, between intention and outcome, or between subjective assessment and objective worth. An important aspect of absurdism is its claim that the world as a whole is absurd. It differs in this regard from the uncontroversial and less global thesis that some particular situations, persons, or phases in life are absurd. The term absurdism is most closely associated with the philosopher Albert Camus. However, important precursors and discussions of the absurd are also found in the works of Soren Kierkegaard. The concept of happiness, regret, and the surrounding anxiety that goes along with our place in the world plays an important role in Kierkegaard's analysis of the absurd. In his book, The Concept of Anxiety, he referred to anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. He identified two core components of the human experience, being the finite and the infinite. What the finite means is basically the reality of our experience in the sense of there being a limited time for us on earth. We only have a certain amount of time here, and thus only so much time to do certain things. The infinite, on the other hand, reflects the polar opposite of this. While it may be true that our time here is limited, we are confronted with the fact that there is a seemingly endless number of possibilities for us during our short time alive. There is a dialectic between the finite and the infinite, and this can create a lot of anxiety for some people. When we are confronted with the fact that we have limited options, given the nature of our time here in the face of the infinite, it can often be soul destroying for people. The great irony of this is that while in theory there are an infinite number of possibilities for us, we often lose ourselves in the face of the infinite, which leads us to not become anything. One might think then that as a result of the despair that can be caused by confronting the infinite, the finite could be potentially less daunting, although this would not be correct either. People, when confronted with the nature of our finite existence, will often just do whatever is expected of them or follow social norms rather than being true to themselves. I think there is a certain irony to the fact that while many people are consciously aware of what Kierkegaard would call the infinite and the problems it can cause people when they confront it, they have no idea about the finite. They merely live life without making any real choices whatsoever and, as stated, do whatever others expect them to. Kierkegaard suggests that the only way out of this is to take a leap of faith towards Christianity, the ultimate irrational experience, which is the most rational thing to do. This is the quintessential subjective experience. In his journals, Kierkegaard writes about the absurd. What is the absurd? It is, as may quite easily be seen, that I, a rational being, must act in a case where my reason, my powers of reflection, tell me, you can just as well do the one thing as the other. That is to say, where my reason and reflection say, you cannot act, and yet here is where I have to act. The absurd, or to act by virtue of the absurd, is to act upon faith. I must act, but reflection has closed the road, so I take one of the possibilities and say, this is what I do. I cannot do otherwise because I am brought to a standstill by my powers of reflection. When looking at Kierkegaard's theory of the absurd, he describes the absurd as the absurd, or to act by the virtue of the absurd, is to act upon faith. He shows this in one of his famous works, Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard talks about Abraham and God, and how God has told Abraham that he had to sacrifice his son Isaac in Genesis. Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, then an angel appeared and prevented Abraham from completing his actions by presenting a ram to sacrifice instead of Isaac. In Kierkegaard's work, He shows that he believes that through the virtue of the absurd, Abraham, even though he went against all reason and ethical duties, he got his son back and affirmed his faith. In terms of the portrayal of murder, if Isaac had been killed by Abraham, it would have been put down to an act of faith and therefore justified, as God had commanded this of Abraham, and that made it ethically okay to commit the murder, as religion plays a part in the absurdity, and Abraham did what was commanded by a higher being and reasoning. Abraham was feeling morally and ethically okay coming up to the murder, as the murder was portrayed as an act of God. But in the end, the angel stopped the murder and Abraham got to keep his son. Kierkegaard's theory of the absurd believes that the absurd needs an irrational but needed religious leap into the unknown in order to find meaning in a meaningless world. Now, moving on to Camus. Albert Camus is by far the most known and recognized philosopher of the absurd. Throughout his works, he regularly mentioned the absurd by name and described its nature in relation to the universe and the human experience in it. In spite of this, though, many people often have a slight misinterpretation of how he identified what makes life absurd. For starters, Camus defined the absurd as a relationship that exists between humanity's desire to seek inherent value and meaning in life, while at the same time being unable to establish either of these in any kind of concrete or definite sense. It could be argued that it is perhaps human nature to pursue meaning. Camus did not deny that people search for it or anything like that. What he argued instead is that there was a fundamental impossibility for meaning to be definitely or definitively established. It is important to note that Camus did not consider the universe to be absurd, nor did he consider pursuing meaning or value to be inherently an absurd concept. What makes the pursuit of meaning absurd is our relationship with the universe and the pursuit of meaning. As he writes in the myth of Sisyphus, "If I see a man armed only with a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is so solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. Likewise, we shall deem a verdict absurd when we contrast it with the verdict the facts apparently dictated. And similarly, a demonstration by the absurd is achieved by comparing the consequences of such a reasoning with the logical reality one wants to set up. In all these cases, from the simplest to the most complex, the magnitude of the absurdity will be in direct ratio to the distance between the two terms of my comparison. There are absurd marriages, challenges, silences, wars, and even peace treaties. For each of them, the absurdity springs from a comparison. I am thus justified in saying that the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. To once again reiterate, the absurd is not a necessity that is born out of the inherent pursuit of meaning. It is something that arises when the particular relation humans have with this pursuit and the broader universe renders it absurd. I find the above quote to be really interesting because it gives us a really great insight into how he conceptualizes this by giving us examples of other things that are absurd because of the relationship involved in them. If we are trying to determine whether or not something is considered an absurd act, to simply view the act itself in isolation from the context in which it exists is not an adequate way of doing so. Only when you take into account the relationship in which it is conducted, relation in which it is conducted with the relation to how it is carried out and the proportion, etc., as Camus said. He used the example of a man with a sword attacking a group armed with machine guns, and this is perfectly analogous to the pursuit of meaning in his philosophy. Attacking a group that is well armed is not itself absurd. It is only absurd when you yourself are not well armed and pose no threat to them, rendering your attack futile and absurd. Likewise, when one pursues meaning or objective moral values, this only becomes absurd because of a lack of capacity or ability to find either of these in a truly definitive way. Camus' analysis of the absurd extends to questions surrounding God and religion. People often characterize him as an atheist existentialist although this is a label that he would once again reject. The capacity for humans to establish whether or not a God exists was beyond the capacity of mere people, as was the ability to establish whether or not one does not exist. Many of Camus' works express a great analysis surrounding the absurdity of the human experience, but none really do so as well as the myth of Sisyphus, and as a result, it is surely his greatest work. Let us talk about Immanuel Kant as well, because an idea very close to the concept of this absurd is due to Kant, who distinguishes between phenomena and noumena. This distinction refers to the gap between how things appear to us and what they are like in themselves. For example, according to Kant, space and times are dimensions belonging to the realm of phenomena, since this is how sensory impressions are organized by the mind, but may not be found on the level of noumena. The concept of the absurd corresponds to the thesis that there is such a gap, and human limitations may limit the mind from ever truly grasping reality. That is, that reality is, in this sense, it remains absurd to the mind.